do so would betray our children and future generations. Some may still deny the overwhelming judgment of science, but none can avoid the devastating impact of raging fires and crippling drought and more powerful storms.
Joining us now is Bob Deans with the Natural Resources Defense Council. And Bob, the prospect for actually passing any big legislation on climate change is pretty grim. The president has signaled that he will do what he can through executive action. How powerful can just what he's able to do himself without Congress, how much of an impact could that have?
A huge impact, Crystal. Last fall when he campaigned, the president said climate is a threat. His opponent, remember, said it's a joke. And the country went with the man who said it's a threat. And on Monday, he showed that he meant what he said, calling for climate action and saying if we don't do it, we'll betray our children, presidential leadership, personal responsibility. It doesn't get any clearer than that. Here's the most important thing he can do, Crystal. He can reduce the carbon emissions, the carbon pollution that is warming our planet coming from our power plants. Those are the single largest sources of industrial carbon pollution across our country. 40% of the carbon in this country coming from those power plants. The president has the authority under the Clean Air Act to set standards reducing those carbon levels. And we at NRDC have put forth a plan that can reduce those levels by 26% by 2020, Crystal, which would reduce our national carbon footprint by 10%. It would save consumers money. It would make our generating capacity much more efficient. It's the right thing to do. We need to strike a blow against climate change.
Well, Bob, I guess picking up on that point then, so if you can have if the EPA is empowered then to set these new standards on emissions and to fight it that way, I guess why wasn't this done sooner? And second of all, with the failure of cap and trade, in the last 4 years, what are we losing then in terms of emissions by having EPA action as opposed to comprehensive cap and trade legislation? What's the difference there? What do we lose by not having cap and trade?
Well, what we can do by going after the power plants and dealing with 40% of our carbon pollution, cutting that piece of it, builds on what the president was able to do in his first term, which is to go after the 30% of the carbon emissions that are coming from our automobiles. And he worked with the automakers to put in place a plan to reduce our mileage, or to improve our mileage, double it by 2025, which will reduce our carbon footprint from our driving in half. That's a big deal. So that's 70% of the carbon emissions in this country that can be dealt with one way or another, the first term and the second term. That's progress.
Bob, we were all just sitting here in the studio wondering if we could get some global warming in here. It is freezing in this climate. But that aside, how big do you think a role nuclear energy is going to play in all of this?
Well, we're getting 20% of our electricity from nuclear power. That's been stable for a long time. We don't really see that changing to any certain extent. The big story in our electricity generation is in wind. Wind is now, it came from nowhere to it's now 4% of the electricity in this country we're getting from wind power. And the Department of Energy says we can grow that to 20%, which would be on par with nuclear power in just 15 years if we stay the course. It's important we continue to invest in our future that way.
Bob, you're talking about all the potential progress here in the second term, but one of the first decisions that President Obama faces right now is the Keystone Pipeline. And I think there's possible consequences for emissions from approving that. I think the expectation is that it's going to be approved. I think what is the estimate from the EPA? It's something like over 1 billion tons of CO2 emissions over 50 years could be produced by this pipeline. Are you concerned that a lot of the good that you're seeing here in the second term could be offset by approving Keystone?
The pipeline's bad news. It would be the carbon equivalent of putting 5 million new cars on the road. That's not the direction we want to be going into. This is some of the dirtiest oil on the planet, piping it through the heart of the breadbasket of America so we can ship it overseas out of the Gulf of Mexico. It's a bad idea.
Do you agree with the consensus it's going to happen, though? He's going to approve it.
We don't. We know the State Department has undertaken a review. We expect results from that at some point. But the State Department is going to look, and John Kerry said yesterday that environmental consequences will be part of that study. And in that context, the impact on climate is huge. And of course, we're destroying the boreal forest in Canada to get this oil out. It takes 2 to 3 times the carbon to get this crude, tar sands crude out of the ground as it does to get conventional oil. Doesn't make sense. It's not going to help the country. It's a big profit scheme for big oil. We need to put an end to it.
All right, Bob Deans, great information. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's a good weekend to escape the cold in a cozy movie theater.